Hello, welcome to episode 4 of the History of English series, English Bounces Back. There are no invasions in this episode, but it does contain one of my favourite characters from the medieval period. I know it's a bit nerdy to have favourite historical characters, but there we are. Before we move on, if you enjoyed this episode, please click like and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and share it with your friends. In the previous episode, we saw how the Norman Conquest transformed England into a bilingual country, with French being used as the language of public administration, the law, and shall we say high society, while English was relegated to an oral language of the non-noble classes. This state of affairs more or less continued for the next 300 years. However, it was a period of constant change, and in less than 200 years the tide was already turning in favour of the English language. While English survived to its relegation to a lower class spoken language, many of the characteristics that it had had in common with the Germanic languages started to disappear. The inflection reduced, the distinction between masculine, feminine, and neuter nouns gradually disappeared. In general, the grammatical structures became simpler. There are many reasons for these, but I suspect one of the main reasons was because you need a practical, simple language in order to live a practical, simple life. While English was gradually changing, the French used by the nobility was also changing. There were also several reasons for this, one being the gradual assimilation between Norman and English communities. Bit by bit, the difference between these populations seemed less important. The need to communicate between these groups meant that there was a gradual merging of the languages for everyday use, just like what had happened between Anglo-Saxon and Old Norse centuries earlier. Probably the most important development occurred in 1215. In 1215, England and France were at war, as was usually the case in the medieval period. In this year, the Duchy of Normandy was lost. A result of this was that there was a step-by-step increase in the proportion of the nobility who started to see themselves not so much as Normans, but as English. This was a very slow, gradual process, and the pace of change varied from one part of the country to the other. London, as always, was in the forefront of this change. I'd like to focus on just a few areas where this change became more apparent. Let's start with what happened in the English Parliament in 1362. In that year, the English Parliament voted that in the future the Parliament business would be discussed in English and not in French. This was a major turning point and not universally appreciated. Many traditionalists lamented the decline of London French, as they called it. However, it was a real sign that English was back in business. Another interesting development was the writing of people like Geoffrey Chaucer. Geoffrey Chaucer is often said to be the father of English literature. In his own time, his main occupation was as a public official, and writing was a hobby. He was born in 1340 and wrote a large number of works during his life, but his most famous work was the Canterbury Tales, written in 1392, just a few years before he died. Chaucer was unusual because he went against the trend by writing in English. Undoubtedly, many of his friends and contemporaries would have been perplexed by this choice of writing in English, or as it was called at the time, vernacular English, rather than in French or Latin. Critics of writing in English would probably have said that it is useless to write in a language when most of the speakers were illiterate, or even if they were not illiterate, they were probably more familiar with reading in French or Latin, which were considered to be the languages of literature. Geoffrey Chaucer is said to have preferred to write in English because it really captured the mood of ordinary people who he depicted. Any of you who have watched a film that was originally in your language and then seen it dubbed in another language will understand how much is lost when you don't use the original language. We can say that Geoffrey Chaucer was one of the first original language purists. Well done, Jeff. So in what way was the English language that came back into general use different from Old English? Here are a couple of examples. The verbs became less inflected. For example, the indicative of the verb come in Old English that you can see here is much more inflected than the Middle English version and much more inflected than the Modern English, which just has a difference in the third person. There was naturally the indicative, the subjunctive, and the imperative inflections of all of these verbs to deal with as well. Most modern English speakers don't know how lucky they are. Old English had masculine, feminine, and neuter nouns like German. Of course, other words had to agree with the gender of the nouns. This is something else that gradually disappeared in the Middle English period. Here are some examples. The good king, you can see, is masculine. The good queen, you can see, is feminine. There are more practical examples here. Where is the toilet is neuter, but there is also a masculine version of where is the toilet, but no feminine. It seems that the discrimination against women in provision of these facilities is nothing new. No one is really sure why gender was abandoned, but a plausible theory is that as Anglo-Saxon, Old Norse, and Norman French didn't use gender in the same way, in modern European languages, nouns that are masculine and feminine do not always agree from one language to another. Apple is feminine in French, but it was masculine in English. Things just got too complicated, and people gradually settled on the neuter for everything. Naturally, there wasn't an instant changeover, but as writers like Chaucer started writing in English, the changes became more established. They also started adding more words to the language and reintroducing lost words. Here are some. There are many other changes, including plural forms. Some parts of the country used n or th as plural forms. The first form survives in plurals like children and oxen. However, the s plural gained prominence. Who knows why? Many other changes occurred over this period, too numerous to go into here, but it's clear that Middle English was a transitional stage and that modern English speaker can make some sense of it. Let's see an example from the great man himself. Here is the Clerk's prologue from the Canterbury Tales, or at least a part of it. Although there are some unusual spellings, for example, like our host said, instead of our host said, we can really understand it fairly clearly. There are not many words that are not clear. There is the third person doth instead of does. Made, M-A-Y-D-E, is obviously spelt differently, and spoused instead of married in line 3. They were new espoused instead of were just married. We can still see this in the modern English word of spouse, meaning husband or wife, and board is often used instead of banquet, table or meal. So, for example, in modern English, full board in a hotel, that you have all your meals in the hotel each day. There is only one word here, I trowed, in the sense of I suppose, that is unusual or different. Everything else is quite clear. What a contrast with Old English. One problem that would plague Middle English and early Modern English was the non-standard spellings. So light might be pronounced in the London way, with the London spelling of L-Y-T-E, but spelt in the Northeastern way. This was probably pronounced in a more German way in the Northeast, like liegt. As there were many different accents and dialects, and people tended to write words as they were pronounced in their own region, the whole spelling system was a bit of a mess, to say the least. If you think English spelling is a mess now, this is nothing. There was also another complication. Vowels started changing pronunciation over this period for no apparent reason. This is known as the Great Vowel Shift. It certainly didn't help. One thing that aided the standardization of spelling was the introduction of the printing press by the businessman, diplomat, spy, and all in all interesting person to know, William Caxton. In 1475 or 76, no one is sure, the printing press was introduced into London. As printing spread over the country, it encouraged the standardization of spelling. The writing of early dictionaries was and remained pretty haphazard, as personal preferences for definitions, spelling, and pronunciation often took precedence over research. Printers were not averse to a little padding to increase their income, as they were often paid by the number of letters they put in the text. If you could convince a customer that your way of spelling a word with more letters is correct, then over the length of a book, you can make a lot of extra profit. A lot of double letters in words are thought to have come from this period. So when somebody says to you, how many S's and L's are there in misspelling? Too many is probably the right answer. Despite the occasional dishonest printer, standardized spelling and cheaper text massively increased literature, but it took a long time for spelling to become more ordered, and many would say it is still not very ordered. Up until now, the story had been about invasions and influential people. As we move closer to the modern era, we will see that social change and technology will become increasingly important factors in the evolution of the language in general and the English language in particular. We'll start to see this happen in the next episode. Bye for now.